You know how it is. You work hard all week, you pay your mortgage, you try to be a decent neighbor, and all you want on a Saturday morning is a little peace, a hot cup of coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of tinkering around your own home. That was my plan anyway. My name's Mark, and my wife, Sarah, and I had bought this lovely little two-story in a quiet, leafy subdivision about 3 years back. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours, a sanctuary from the daily grind. Sarah works as a 911 dispatcher, a job that requires nerves of steel and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm in the face of utter chaos. I've always admired that about her. Me, I'm more of a research and planning type, an engineer by trade, which means I like things to be logical and orderly. Our HOA, the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, was usually just a background hum, sending out newsletters about lawn maintenance standards and the annual picnic. Most of the board members were reasonable enough, retired folks mostly, looking for something to keep them occupied. But then there was Mrs. Albright, Agnes Albright. She was the self-appointed guardian of all things Willow Creek, a woman whose primary joy in life seemed to derive from finding fault and asserting authority she didn't quite possess in the way she thought she did. She had that particular brand of pursed lip indignation down to a fine art, and her presence usually meant someone was about to have a perfectly good day mildly, or sometimes significantly inconvenienced. That particular Saturday, Sarah was on an early shift, meaning she'd left before sunrise. I had the house to myself. The air was crisp, the coffee was brewing, and I had a little project lined up, assembling a new shelving unit in my home office. It was an internal job, nothing that would alter the sacred exterior aesthetics of Willow Creek, nothing that required permits or HOA approval. Just me, a flat-pack box, an Allen key, and the prospect of a more organized workspace. I'd even laid out a tarp to protect the carpet. Domestic bliss, right? I'd had a minor brush with Mrs. Albright a few months prior. Something about the precise shade of beige I'd used to repaint a small section of window trim a shade. I might add, that was pre-approved. She'd huffed and puffed but eventually had to concede I was within the guidelines, though not without implying I'd somehow bent the rules to my nefarious will. It left a lingering sense that she was watching, waiting for a more substantial infraction. My project was simple, straightforward. Or so I thought. The aroma of freshly brewed dark roast filled the kitchen, a counterpoint to the faint scent of pine from the new shelving components I'd unboxed in the living room, ready to carry upstairs. I was looking forward to the quiet hum of concentration, the satisfying click of pieces fitting together. Just the little things, you know? The small victories of a weekend warrior. Sarah had called me on her break, around 9 a.m., just to check in. We chatted for a bit about her morning, a couple of fender benders, a lost dog, the usual tapestry of a suburban emergency line. She sounded a little tired but, as always, completely in control. "Try not to build anything too structurally ambitious without me, honey," she joked, knowing my tendency to sometimes over-engineer even the simplest tasks. "Just some shelves, babe," I'd replied. "Promise the house will still be standing when you get home." We hung up, and I poured myself a second cup of coffee, ready to tackle the assembly. The sun was streaming through the windows, birds were chirping, and for a glorious hour, all was right with the world. It was the kind of quiet that almost hums with potential, the potential for a productive yet relaxing day. Little did I know, that hum was about to be replaced by a far more grating sound. The first indication that my tranquil Saturday was about to be torpedoed came around 10:30. It wasn't a gentle tap, mind you, but a series of sharp, insistent raps on the front door, the kind that brooks no ignoring. I sighed, putting down my screwdriver. Through the peephole, my heart sank a little. There she was, Mrs. Albright, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her face set in that familiar expression of grim purpose. She was wearing a brightly colored windbreaker, despite the mildness of the day, as if dressed for an expedition into hostile territory. My territory, apparently. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to remain calm and polite, and opened the door a crack, leaving the security chain engaged. "Good morning, Mrs. Albright," I said, trying to sound as unbothered as possible. "What can I do for you?" Her eyes, magnified slightly by her glasses, flickered over my shoulder, trying to peer into the house. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of any reciprocal pleasantry. "I'm conducting routine HOA compliance checks this morning. Routine? On a Saturday, unannounced, by barging up to people's front doors?" "Oh," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Is there a particular issue you're concerned about? My lawn was mowed on Thursday, and the recycling bins were brought in last night." I knew perfectly well my exterior was immaculate. Her gaze narrowed. "It's not about the exterior, Mr. Henderson. There have been reports of unapproved internal modifications and potential unsanctioned commercial activity within the Willow Creek community." My eyebrows went up. "Unsanctioned commercial activity? Mrs. Albright, I'm an engineer. I work for Tech Solutions downtown. My wife is a 911 dispatcher. The only commercial activity happening here is the steady depletion of my coffee supply." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, which only seemed to irritate her further. "Be that as it may," she pressed on, "I need to come inside to verify compliance. Standard procedure. Now, I'm a reasonable guy. But I've also read our HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS cover to cover, mostly out of sheer boredom one rainy Sunday, but also because I believe in knowing the rules of any game you're playing. And I knew for a fact that routine checks, allowing unannounced entry into private homes for vague, unsubstantiated reports, were definitely not standard procedure. "Actually, Mrs. Albright," I said, still politely, "I don't believe the CC and RS grant the HOA board arbitrary access to the inside of our homes without either a specific, documented violation related to common areas, an emergency like a fire or flood affecting other units, or with prior written notice and consent for a specific, agreed-upon purpose. I haven't received any such notice." I even remembered the specific clause, Article 7, Section 3B. Her face tightened. "Are you refusing an official HOA request, Mr. Henderson?" she asked, her voice rising a decibel. "I'm asserting my right to privacy in my own home, Mrs. Albright, as outlined in the very documents you're supposedly enforcing. If you have a specific, written complaint or concern based on actual evidence, please submit it through the proper channels, and I'll be happy to address it. Otherwise, I'm rather busy this morning." I was trying to be firm but not overtly hostile. Internally, though, the annoyance was building. This was my Saturday, my sanctuary, and she was treating it like a public inspection site. The sheer audacity of it was galling. I thought back to the window trim incident. She'd actually brought a paint swatch card and held it up against the house, squinting and muttering for a good 10 minutes before reluctantly admitting it was, indeed, Willow Creek Beige number 4. This felt like an escalation of that same intrusive behavior, a power trip fueled by a little bit of authority and a lot of self-importance. Mrs. Albright did not take my well-reasoned, bylaw-supported refusal well. Her lips thinned into a pale line, and a flush crept up her neck. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice now laced with a distinct edge of steel, "I am a duly elected member of the HOA board. I have a responsibility to ensure all residents are adhering to the community standards. Your refusal is highly suspicious. What are you trying to hide?" I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "Mrs. Albright, I'm hiding my desire to assemble a shelving unit in peace, and possibly the fact I haven't vacuumed yet this week. Neither of which, I believe, falls under HOA jurisdiction." I even gestured vaguely towards the living room where the flat pack box lay. "If you'd like to see the plans for a Billy bookcase from IKEA, I can probably find them, but I assure you, it's hardly a structural alteration requiring committee approval." Her eyes narrowed further. "Don't be facetious, young man. This is a serious matter. We have rules for a reason. They protect our property values. What if you're running some sort of noisy workshop in there? Or worse?" She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Are you subletting rooms without authorization? That's strictly forbidden," I sighed. This was escalating beyond mere busybody behavior into outright accusation. "Mrs. Albright, with all due respect, you're making baseless allegations. I'm not running a workshop, I'm not subletting rooms, and I'm certainly not doing anything that negatively impacts my neighbors or common property values from inside my own office. I know the rules. I also know my rights, I decided to try a slightly different tack. Look, I said, softening my tone a fraction. I understand you have a role to fulfill. Perhaps you could tell me what specific report you received? Who made it? What exactly is the concern? Maybe we can clear this up without you needing to inspect my sock drawer. I had a copy of the HOA bylaws on my desk, a highlighted PDF version I'd consulted more than once. I briefly considered fetching it and waving it at her, but figured it would only inflame the situation. Her response was to puff herself up even more. The source of the information is confidential, for their protection, and my concern is your blatant disregard for HOA authority. If you have nothing to hide, why not just let me take a quick look around? It will only take 5 minutes. Because, Mrs. Albright, I said, my patience wearing decidedly thin, it's a matter of principle. My home is my private space. Unless there's a legitimate, legally sound reason as defined in our governing documents, I don't have to allow anyone entry, HOA board member or not. And frankly, your aggressive and accusatory tone isn't making me any more inclined to cooperate with a request that oversteps your authority. I could see her trying to peer past me again, her gaze darting around. She even put a hand on the edge of the door, as if she might try to push it open. I instinctively put my own hand on the inside of the door, not aggressively, but as a clear statement that it was staying put. This is outrageous, she sputtered, her face now quite red. I've never been treated with such disrespect. I will be reporting this insubordination to the full board. You'll receive a notice of violation and a hefty fine. You're welcome to do that, Mrs. Albright, I said calmly, and I will be happy to respond to any official, written communication through the proper channels, citing the relevant bylaws that protect my right to quiet enjoyment and privacy. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have shelves to build. I started to gently close the door. This, it turned out, was the spark that lit her fuse. Mrs. Albright reacted as if I'd slapped her. Don't you dare close that door on me, she shrieked, her voice escalating to a pitch that probably violated several noise ordinances all by itself. You are creating a public disturbance. You are being hostile and uncooperative. I am an official representative of this community. I paused, the door still slightly ajar, the chain still on. Mrs. Albright, I said, my voice dangerously calm now. The only one creating a disturbance here is you. You're on my property, making unfounded accusations, and refusing to accept a polite and legally sound refusal of an unauthorized demand. I am asking you, once again, to please leave. Her eyes blazed. I will not leave. Not until I've conducted my inspection. You people think you can just move in here and flout the rules. I've been on this board for 10 years. I know what's what. It was then that she pulled out what she clearly considered her trump card. She whipped out her smartphone with a flourish, her fingers stabbing at the screen. That's it, she declared, her voice ringing with theatrical indignation. I am calling the police. You are harassing an HOA official in the performance of her duties. You are clearly hiding something illegal, and I am concerned for my safety. My jaw, which had been set pretty firmly, actually dropped a little. The police? She was going to call 911 because I wouldn't let her snoop around my house on a whim? The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was almost breathtaking. Part of me wanted to laugh. Part of me was genuinely appalled at the misuse of emergency services. You're calling the police? I repeated, just to make sure I'd heard her correctly. Because I won't let you into my private home without a valid reason? Mrs. Albright, that's a massive overreaction, not to mention a waste of police resources. It is not an overreaction, she insisted, already dialing. You are threatening and intimidating. I feel unsafe. She turned slightly, angling the phone so I could hear her clearly as she spoke into it. Yes, 911? I need to report a hostile resident at 128 Willow Creek Lane. He's being aggressive and refusing lawful entry to an HOA official. I'm afraid of what he might do. He's barricaded himself in his house and is acting very suspiciously. Please send officers immediately. I listened to her dramatic, exaggerated account, a strange sense of calm washing over me. The initial shock was replaced by a dawning realization. a tiny spark of an idea that began to flicker in the back of my mind. Sarah was on duty. Sarah was a 911 dispatcher. While Mrs. Albright was busy painting me as a dangerous miscreant to some poor, unsuspecting dispatcher on the other end of the line, I leaned back against the doorframe, a very faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. I could have called Sarah's direct line at the dispatch center, or texted her, but that felt wrong, like I was trying to pull strings. No, it was better to let this play out organically. Let Mrs. Albright dig her own hole. I even idly considered going to make that fresh pot of coffee. My nonchalance seemed to enrage her further. She kept glancing at me, expecting, I suppose, some sort of panicked capitulation. Instead, I just watched her, my expression one of patient curiosity. "They're sending a car," she announced triumphantly, snapping her phone shut. "Now you'll see what happens when you defy the rules and threaten board members." I simply nodded. "All right, Mrs. Albright. We'll wait for them together, shall we?" The sheer irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she was calling in the cavalry to put me in my place. Little did she know, the person who likely fielded her histrionic call, the calm, professional voice that would have assured her officers were on their way, was my very own wife. As Mrs. Albright stood on my porch, radiating smug anticipation, I mentally ran through the probabilities. The dispatch center wasn't huge, but it wasn't tiny either. There were usually several dispatchers on duty during a Saturday morning shift. What were the odds that Sarah, specifically, had taken this particular call? It wasn't a certainty, but it was definitely a non-zero possibility. I tried to recall if I could hear the dispatcher's voice from where Albright was standing, but her own agitated narration had drowned out any specifics from her phone's earpiece. Still, the thought was intriguing. I imagined Sarah, headset on, professionally typing notes, her expression carefully neutral as she listened to Mrs. Albright's increasingly outlandish claims about the hostile resident at her own address. The image was almost comical. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I subtly pulled it out, keeping it angled away from Mrs. Albright's prying eyes. It was a text message from Sarah. Just 3 words and an emoji. "Interesting call." Thinking face, a slow grin spread across my face. I quickly typed back, "Oh, you have no idea. Enjoy the show." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my sense of quiet amusement growing. So Sarah had taken the call. This was going to be even better than I thought.
I marveled at her professionalism.
She would have handled it by the book, dispatching officers as required by protocol, regardless of her personal connection to the address. That was Sarah, dedicated, unflappable. Mrs. Albright, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with self-importance, casting triumphant glares my way. She was convinced she was about to witness my public dressing down, my comeuppance for daring to question her authority. She probably envisioned me being led away in handcuffs, or at the very least, groveling for forgiveness as the police forced me to allow her precious inspection. The delicious irony was that the very system she was attempting to weaponize against me was, in a small but significant way, already in on the joke thanks to my wife. I thought about Sarah's day. Saturday mornings could be deceptively busy for emergency services. While suburbia slept in or did chores, accidents still happened, medical emergencies arose, and yes, sometimes people called 911 for things that were far from actual emergencies. I pictured her, calmly juggling multiple lines, coordinating police, fire, and ambulance services, and then having to deal with Mrs. Albright's petty tyranny. It must have been an unwelcome, trivial interruption in a stream of genuinely critical situations. I almost felt sorry for the officers who were about to be dragged into this nonsense. Their time wasted on what was essentially a neighborhood squabble blown wildly out of proportion by one entitled individual. But then I remembered Mrs. Albright's smug expression, and my sympathy for the officers was quickly overshadowed by my anticipation of her eventual deflation. I maintained my calm demeanor, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "They should be here soon," I commented mildly, as if discussing the weather. "I hope they can clear this up quickly. I really do have those shelves to assemble." Mrs. Albright just sniffed disdainfully, clearly interpreting my calmness as arrogance that was soon to be shattered. The wait wasn't long. Within about 10 minutes, The distant wail of a siren grew closer, then resolved into the flashing lights of a police cruiser turning onto our street. Mrs. Albright visibly perked up, a hunter spotting her prey. Or in this case, her enforcers. The police cruiser, a standard black and white, pulled up to the curb right in front of my house. Mrs. Albright practically skipped down my porch steps to meet it, her windbreaker flapping, clipboard at the ready. She was clearly eager to present her version of events first, to frame me as the villain before I even had a chance to speak. 2 officers emerged from the car. One was older, a sergeant by the look of his stripes, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense air. The other was younger, taller, with a more observant, watchful expression. They both looked thoroughly professional, if a little weary, as if this was already the 10th non-emergency they dealt with that morning. I waited on my porch, letting Mrs. Albright have her initial audience. I figured it was better to let her expend her dramatic energy first. Her voice, animated and shrill, carried clearly back to me. "Officers, thank heavens you're here," she exclaimed, gesturing wildly towards me. "This man, Mr. Henderson, has been incredibly hostile and aggressive. He's barricaded himself in his house and refuses to allow a perfectly legal HOA inspection. I'm an official board member, and I have a right to enter and ensure compliance with community rules, which are practically law, you know. I fear for my safety, and frankly, who knows what illegal activities he's conducting in there." She painted a vivid picture of me as some sort of unhinged recluse, possibly running a meth lab or a den of international spies from my suburban home. I had to suppress a chuckle. The officers listened patiently, their expressions unreadable. The sergeant occasionally nodded, while the younger officer just watched me, his gaze steady. After Mrs. Albright had finally wound down her initial torrent of accusations, the sergeant turned his attention to me. "Sir, could you step down here, please?" he asked, his voice calm and authoritative. I descended the porch steps and approached them, stopping a respectful distance away. "Good morning, officers," I said. "Mark Henderson. This is my home." "All right, Mr. Henderson," the sergeant said. "Mrs. Albright here says you're refusing her entry and being hostile. What's your side of the story?" I took a breath. "My side is fairly simple, Sergeant. Mrs. Albright appeared at my door unannounced about 20 minutes ago, demanding to enter my home for what she called a routine HOA compliance check. Based on unspecified reports, I politely informed her that, according to our HOA bylaws, she doesn't have the authority to demand entry without prior written notice, a specific documented violation, or an emergency situation like a fire or flood. None of those conditions apply. I refused her entry, as is my right. She became rather agitated, made several unfounded accusations, and then decided to call you when I wouldn't back down. I haven't threatened her, I haven't been aggressive, and I certainly haven't barricaded myself in anywhere. I was just trying to enjoy my Saturday morning. I saw the younger officer subtly glance at my house, then back at me. "Do you have a copy of these HOA bylaws, Mr. Henderson?" he asked. "As a matter of fact, I do," I replied. "I can pull them up on my phone, or I have a printed copy inside if you'd like to see the relevant sections regarding access to private property." Mrs. Albright bristled. "The bylaws are complicated. He's twisting them. The point is, he's being uncooperative and secretive." The sergeant held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, let him speak." "So, Mr. Henderson, you're saying this is a dispute over HOA rules, and you believe you're within your rights to deny her access at this time?" "Precisely, Sergeant," I affirmed. "I have broken no laws. I am simply protecting my privacy within my own home. I believe Mrs. Albright is overstepping her authority as an HOA board member." The officers exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. The sergeant then addressed Mrs. Albright. "Ma'am, from what Mr. Henderson is saying, this sounds primarily like a civil disagreement regarding your HOA's internal rules and regulations. Generally, the police don't get involved in enforcing HOA bylaws unless a criminal offense has occurred, like trespassing after being formally warned, or a genuine threat or assault." Mrs. Albright's face began to contort with frustration. "But it is a threat," she insisted. His refusal is a threat to the order of this community. He could be doing anything in there. It's highly suspicious. He's hiding something. I just know it. Don't you understand? HOA rules are there to protect us all. He needs to be compelled to cooperate. She was practically sputtering now, her carefully constructed narrative of imminent danger and heroic intervention starting to crumble. The younger officer, who had been mostly quiet, spoke up. Mrs. Albright, with all due respect, a resident refusing entry for an HOA inspection, especially if they believe they're within their rights according to your own bylaws, doesn't typically constitute a police matter or a 911 emergency. Did Mr. Henderson make any specific threats towards you? Did he display any weapons? Did he physically prevent you from leaving his property? Mrs. Albright hesitated. Well, no, not exactly, she admitted grudgingly. But his tone was very defiant, and he barricaded the door by keeping it closed. The sergeant sighed, a sound that spoke volumes of long experience with such calls. Ma'am, keeping one's door closed is not barricading oneself in. It's standard practice for most homeowners. It was at this point that I decided to play my little ace. I'd let them establish the basics, let Albright make her case, and let the officers begin to see the situation for what it was. Now felt like the right moment. Officers? I said, injecting a casual, almost offhand tone into my voice. This whole situation is rather ironic, actually. It's a bit of a coincidence, but my wife, Sarah, she's a dispatcher with your department. Sarah Henderson. She's actually on duty right now. I wouldn't be surprised if she was the one who took Mrs. Albright's call. I watched for their reaction. The younger officer's eyebrows shot up. The sergeant paused, his head tilting slightly as he processed this new piece of information. Mrs. Albright, who had been about to launch into another tirade, froze mid-sentence, her mouth slightly agape. Sarah Henderson? The sergeant repeated, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Yeah, I know Sarah. Good dispatcher. Solid. She's working C-shift today, right? That's her. I confirmed with a slight smile. The atmosphere shifted palpably. It wasn't that they would suddenly throw procedure out the window, but a certain understanding, a subtle recalibration, was definitely taking place. They were no longer just dealing with a hostile resident and a concerned HOA official. They were dealing with a fellow first responder spouse and an HOA official who had. It was becoming increasingly clear. Significantly overplayed her hand by calling 911. The younger officer looked from me to Mrs. Albright, then back to me, a new light dawning in his eyes. He even had the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Mrs. Albright, however, looked as though she'd been struck by lightning. Her face went from red with indignation to a pale, sickly white. The penny didn't just drop for Mrs. Albright. It crashed through the floor with the force of a meteor. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, darted from me to the officers and back again. His wife is the dispatcher? She stammered, her voice suddenly small and unsteady. The bluster and outrage had vanished, replaced by a dawning horror. The sergeant nodded slowly, his gaze now fixed on Mrs. Albright with a new, less patient intensity. Yes, ma'am, it appears so. Sarah Henderson is one of our most reliable dispatchers, he paused, letting the implications sink in. Which means, Mrs. Albright, that when you called 911 to report this situation, you were, in all likelihood, speaking to the wife of the very man you were accusing of being hostile and suspicious. Mrs. Albright opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked like a fish gasping for air. Any attempt to backtrack or deny seemed to die on her lips. The sheer, unmitigated awkwardness of her position was written all over her face. The younger officer, who seemed to be enjoying this far more than his senior partner, chimed in, his tone still professional but with an unmistakable undercurrent of something else, perhaps amusement, perhaps mild disapproval. Ma'am, we take misuse of the 911 system very seriously. It's for genuine emergencies. While we understand HOA disputes can be frustrating, calling emergency services because someone won't let you into their house for a non-emergency inspection, well, that ties up resources that might be needed for actual life or death situations. The sergeant picked up the thread. especially when the call is based on exaggerated claims. Barricaded himself in, acting suspiciously, fearing for your safety. Those are strong words, Mrs. Albright. Words that trigger a priority response. Dispatcher Henderson would have had to treat your call with utmost seriousness based on what you told her. Mrs. Albright visibly wilted. The clipboard, once her symbol of authority, now seemed like a lead weight in her hands. She looked down at her shoes, then up at the officers with a pleading expression. I just thought, he was being so uncooperative. Her voice trailed off. The officers were not moved. Ma'am, the sergeant continued, his voice firm but fair. Mr. Henderson appears to be within his rights to deny you entry under these circumstances. He states he knows the bylaws and he's offered to show them to you. This is a civil matter for your HOA to resolve through its own internal procedures, formal written notices, hearings, that sort of thing. It is not a police emergency. And quite frankly, he added, his eyes narrowing slightly, making what appear to be unfounded or exaggerated claims to 911 is a serious issue. We could issue a citation for misuse of emergency services at the word citation. Mrs. Albright flinched as if physically struck. The fight was completely gone from her. She looked small, deflated, and utterly mortified. The image of her, moments before, puffed up with self-importance and threatening me with police action, was now replaced by this picture of humiliated defeat. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. Her attempt to wield authority, to bring the weight of the law down upon me, had backfired in the most spectacular and personal way imaginable. She hadn't just called 911 on a resistant homeowner. She'd essentially tattled on her dispatcher's husband to the dispatcher herself. The satisfaction I felt was immense, but I kept my expression neutral, allowing the officers to handle it. There was no need for me to rub it in. The situation was doing a fine job of that all by itself. The officers confirmed with me one last time that I felt safe and that the immediate issue was resolved from my perspective, which I assured them it was. They then turned back to a now thoroughly cowed Mrs. Albright. The officers gave Mrs. Albright a stern, official warning about the misuse of 911, explaining the potential legal consequences and the strain such calls put on emergency resources. They advised her, in no uncertain terms, to familiarize herself thoroughly with proper HOA procedures and to use official channels for any future disputes, rather than resorting to emergency calls for non-emergencies. Her face was a mask of mortification. She mumbled a few barely audible apologies, nodding meekly at everything they said. The imperious HOA enforcer had completely evaporated, leaving behind a rather flustered and embarrassed woman. With a final nod to me, and a parting, "Have a good day, Mr. Henderson, and tell Sarah we said hi," the officers got back into their cruiser and drove away, leaving Mrs. Albright standing alone on the sidewalk. She didn't look at me. She couldn't meet my eyes. She just clutched her clipboard, which now seemed to symbolize her folly rather than her authority, and practically scuttled away down the street, her brightly colored windbreaker a beacon of her hasty retreat. I watched her go, a profound sense of relief and vindication washing over me. It wasn't just that I had stood my ground and been proven right. It was the sheer, delicious irony of how it had all unfolded. Her ultimate weapon, the 911 call, had been her ultimate undoing, all thanks to the serendipitous fact that my amazing wife was on the other end of that line. I went back inside, a wide grin finally breaking free. The first thing I did was send Sarah a text. "Coast is clear. Albright has retreated in disarray. You, my dear, are a legend." Officers said hi. "By the way," a few minutes later, she replied, "Just doing my job, honey. Glad it's sorted. Some people, honestly. Details when I get home." "You bet," I texted back. "This one's going in the family history books." I made myself that fresh pot of coffee and finally got to work on my shelving unit. The assembly process felt sweeter. Each screw tightened a small victory. Each shelf clicked into place a quiet celebration. The peace in my home, so rudely interrupted, had been restored, and then some. When Sarah got home that evening, tired but with an amused sparkle in her eyes, we rehashed the entire incident over dinner. She filled me in on her side, how she'd recognized our address instantly when Albright gave it, how she'd had to maintain absolute professionalism while listening to the increasingly wild accusations against me. "Honestly, Mark," she said, shaking her head as she laughed, "when she said you'd barricaded yourself in, I almost lost it. I was picturing you with furniture piled against the door, wielding a spatula like a weapon." "Hey, it's a very versatile spatula," I joked. "But seriously, you handled it perfectly." She had no idea Sarah explained that while she couldn't intervene directly or give me any special treatment, she had made a note on the call log about the address being familiar and to ensure officers were aware it might be a civil dispute, a subtle flag for them to be thorough. She also mentioned that her supervisor had listened in on a portion of the call, standard procedure for quality control, and had raised an eyebrow at the nature of the complaint versus the resources being deployed. Apparently, Mrs. Albright's call had already been flagged internally as a potential misuse even before the officers arrived and discovered the connection. News of the incident, as these things often do, trickled through the neighborhood grapevine. Whether it was from neighbors who witnessed the police presence, or perhaps Albright herself complaining to someone who then spread the more amusing version of events, I couldn't say. But within a week, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Albright's credibility within the HOA seemed to take a significant hit. There were whispers at the next HOA meeting, which I attended just to observe, about overzealous enforcement and bringing disrepute to the board. She kept a very low profile, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. The sweet taste of poetic justice was better than any coffee. Life in Willow Creek settled back into its usual rhythm, but with a subtle, positive shift. Mrs. Albright, it seemed, had learned a rather public and humbling lesson. She was still on the HOA board, but her pronouncements were fewer and far more measured. She certainly never approached my property again, not even to comment on the perfectly manicured lawn or the, still HOA-approved beige, window trim. If she saw me out gardening or washing my car, she'd find a sudden, urgent reason to be looking in the opposite direction or to cross the street. It was a small thing, but it made our peaceful enjoyment of our home that much more complete. The incident became a bit of a legend in our household. The Ballad of Agnes Albright and the 911 dispatcher, Sarah, and I would recount it sometimes with friends, always to gales of laughter and head-shaking disbelief. It served as a good reminder of a few important truths. Know your rights, stand your ground calmly but firmly, and never underestimate the delightful ways karma can choose to operate. Sometimes the universe, or in this case, the 911 dispatch roster, has a funny way of ensuring that those who misuse their power or try to bully others end up tripping over their own feet in the most spectacular fashion. The whole episode reinforced my admiration for Sarah. Not just because her job inadvertently saved me from a prolonged and ridiculous confrontation, but because of her unwavering professionalism throughout. She handled an absurd situation involving her own husband and home with the same calm competence she brings to genuine life-and-death emergencies every day. That, to me, is true strength. For anyone out there dealing with their own version of Mrs. Albright, be it an overzealous HOA board member, a petty bureaucrat, or just an entitled individual convinced the world revolves around them, I hope our little story offers a bit of encouragement. Don't let them intimidate you. Arm yourself with knowledge, whether it's HOA bylaws, local ordinances, or just a clear understanding of your own boundaries. Stay calm, be articulate, and don't be afraid to say no when no is the right answer. And perhaps most importantly, always be aware that sometimes the very systems bullies try to manipulate can have unexpected safeguards, or even better, wonderfully ironic twists, built right in. You never know when your own dispatcher wife equivalent might be quietly working behind the scenes, ensuring that justice, in its own peculiar way, is served. As for Mrs. Albright, I heard a few months later that she'd decided not to run for re-election to the HOA board, citing a desire to spend more time on her hydrangeas. I like to think her hydrangeas are now subject to the most meticulously documented, bylaw-compliant care imaginable. And every time I walk past her house and see her tending them, I can't help but smile a little, remembering that chaotic Saturday morning when a simple refusal to open my door led to an emergency call she'll likely never forget. And for heaven's sake, people only call 911 for real emergencies. You never know who might be answering the phone.